Welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast. Thanks for joining us on the Journal of Biophilic Design today. I apologise that I have the tail end of a cold, so I'm sorry for sounding like a steam train today. But we are joined by Jenna Mikus. She's founder of the Eudae Group. We're going to be talking about Eudaimonia, which will all tie in and it will become clear shortly. She's also Honorary Fellow of the University of Melbourne. So she's dialing in from Australia at the moment. She's strategic advisor specialising in balancing architectural science with well-being. She's got an unconventional journey from engineering, which is always lovely to hear a woman in engineering, and business strategy. She's moved into pioneering research in sustainable design, well-being, and today we're going to be chatting Aristotle, Eudaimonia, biophilia, sustainability, collaboration, and also how and why we need to navigate silos in design, which, as everybody knows, the Journal of Biophilic Design is all about blowing silos out of the water. I don't know if that's quite the right analogy, but anyway. Plus, we'll be discussing how to bring grand scale concepts and experience into real world design problems. But so first of all, Jenna, many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Oh, lovely. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, you have an unconventional background. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey, please, into the design world and also what you do now?
Yeah, of course. It is a bit unconventional, I must say, and I'm a bit self-conscious speaking to you about eudaimonia too, because I know that you're such a specialist with philosophy and having that understanding. But I arrived at eudaimonia and some of the philosophy-informed aspects of design much later in my career. When I first began, I started just by being enamored by how things worked, and I didn't quite know what I wanted to study other than engineering when I was quite young. And because of the school that I went to, they primarily had mechanical engineering and normal forms of engineering, a bit conventional at the time. And so I ended up doing mechanical engineering with art history and business. It was just very unique. And it was at Johns Hopkins, which is, not an unconventional university. Really, they really like those silos and specialties. But for me as an artsy engineer, that just really spoke to me. And I was able to get some of those outlets and creatively apply some of the things that I would hear in an art history class and do so within some of my different studio work a little bit differently. And as a consequence, I was recruited out before I even graduated by Accenture to do really large scale government consulting, not at all what I had originally planned out to do. But because I liked the creative approach and the managing of ideas and preliminary strategy generation, that was just something that they really appreciated and they wanted in Accenture employees at the time. So I ended up doing that with government for almost 10 years with Accenture and then Booz Allen. And ironically, I was taken to the Australian tax office for a recruitment and retention plan. And while I was working there, I was really enamored by the building that I was in, which was just beautifully natural daylight, had a variety of things such as composting happening, a real understanding to what occupants wanted in space, if they wanted to choose to work in, perhaps a close space for focus, perhaps something that would be more idea generating with a large group and conference room. There was just that understanding. And to me, that was something I had always felt. I was very driven by the environments I would be in, where I would study, where I would work. And so I figured, I love working with clients, but I want to do it in an industry that I'm really passionate about. And that creative engineering kind of came to the fore, and I realized architecture might be that satisfying next step for me. So I pursued a master's of science at the Architectural Association. And so I was still kind of an engineer, but at an architecture school, and learned how to design and retrofit buildings so they require less energy. And while that was really interesting, we had a visiting professor from Cambridge named Nick Baker, and he would talk about adaptive comfort theory and how people would interact with their spaces. So it wouldn't be about designing the heck out of a building so that it would just automatically know how to respond and do things based upon the time of year and the comfort zone to aim for. It would be about also having openable windows so that people could engage with the space and have that interactivity with the spaces that they occupy. inside. And to me, that was really transformative, having kind of an outside-in approach by enabling built environment designers to be better designers, but also an inside-out approach by, perhaps advocating through baseline understanding and education, occupants so that they could make better decisions. There was a great paper at the time by Catherine Janda that talked about buildings don't use energy, people do. And to me, that was really huge because Nudge, the book, had just come out, and it was all about how can we actually encourage people to make better choices and not just wastefully use energy. So I did that work for about a decade. That smart, sustainable strategy work. Got into a little bit more of the intelligent building side of things with building intelligence, looking at analytics and research, how you could actually do things in different ways through data, learn from data, see themes, and then perhaps use that information to look forward. But what I really saw coming up on the landscape was all of this talk about health and well-being, which around 2014, 2015 was still a burgeoning interest. And some of my smarter clients were asking where it was being done well. And I didn't have a whole lot of examples to point to. And so I basically, out of nowhere, decided to accept an offer to do a PhD in Australia, start my own consulting firm, and pursue the idea of eudaimonia, which was a word that I had come across actually while in London on holiday. And it just really struck me when I was thinking about what to name my company. And to me, eudaimonia was really what I wanted to aim for, where people could realize their best selves and experience flourishing. And that's what I do with eudaimonic design today.
Fantastic. That's really nice. And biophilic design for me actually weaves into this sort of this, the eudaimonic kind of way of being, if you want. The kind of principles of happiness and things which we're going to talk about very shortly. But talking about nature connection, actually, in biophilia, and I know you're passionate about that connection too. I mean, you mentioned already being in that building where you had the natural light and also the zoning and being able to create spaces and places, for people. Can you tell me a little bit from your perspective why you think this biophilic design, sort of nature connection, more nature patterns and things like that are important right now in particular?
I think for a variety of reasons, just, we as humans have that innate need to connect. And of course, that's where biophilia, the language, the term, and everything come from. I think we're hungry for connection, and we hear about it all the time in the context of social. COVID really shone a light on our need to remain connected in ways that we prefer. So it didn't always necessarily mean connecting, ad nauseum every day in a little bit of an unusual circumstance that might be more uncomfortable than comfortable. But I think it also enabled us to realize that we need connection in different ways,
Mm.
connection into our spaces. We recognize our space, we have that place-based learning and understanding and appreciation. But also with that comes the place when we look more at natural environment and recognizing, this is where we are, this is what we ascribe ourselves to, this is how we define ourselves. I'm now in Australia, as you mentioned, and there is a really beautiful Aboriginal philosophy, which was about recognizing that I am here, therefore I am. So a different take on the Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And I think that really encapsulates the necessity of space and how important space is to us. And when we think about space, or really preferably place-based understanding, that's where we start understanding how important it is to us, how it defines us, and how it can offer connection if we just take a moment to look around and appreciate what we're surrounded by. And that to me is the different type of connection that I, as more of an introvert, always need. So.
Well, it's really interesting that you say, the Indigenous, the Aboriginal voice there. I am here, therefore I am, versus the Western, if you want, the Descartes kind of philosophy. I think, therefore I am. So one being very much like this is we are in nature, we are here. This is where we are, more place, versus I think, which is all just in our heads and not in reality. Although, okay, yes, there's a whole bunch of philosophy we could talk about here, but I'm just wondering, that's probably one of the fundamental shifts in how our design, particularly in buildings, has and cities have changed, because it's more theory and ideas rather than reality.
Yeah, no, I think so. And I think it's being comfortable in that discomfort, our not knowing. And that's something that, of course, a lot of us are just not familiar with and haven't really been exposed to and therefore, understand. And I think it's just, slowly recognizing that we may not have all the answers and that perhaps the place has more answers than we do. That's really where, we get into this dissonant interaction of, all right. Because we don't have all the answers, maybe we should plug into something that's much older than us, that far wiser than us.
Mhm.
And with that, the land certainly constitutes that and satisfies that need. So I think if we can have a more engaging connection with the land, that perhaps could be the answer.
Hmm. And I was actually going to say as well, and I think Descartes and that all that whole period, their minds were allowed to think and to create and to explore more cerebral kind of process and belief and sort of structure of the world because actually the environment lent itself to that, I think. But anyway, that's
Yeah.
back to buildings, environment, space, blah blah blah. Anyway,
Yeah.
I'm not going to go down that route because we're going to talk about eudaimonia now. Anyway, before we go off on a bit of a tangent, yeah, I want to explore the concept of eudaimonia. I mean, obviously, it's a fundamental bedrock of your practice, which you mentioned just now, and also to your approach to design. Can you set the scene maybe? Can you tell us a little bit about this, please?
Of course. So, eudaimonia is a word that is basically entering more common discourse now, but years ago I don't think it was as well known. But you and daimon are really the basis of the word. So you is good and daimon is spirit, or health sometimes. So I tend to recognize it as good spirit. A lot of times it's, I would say, incorrectly referenced and defined as being happiness. But then again, there's an entire field of happiness studies that oftentimes is used interchangeably with positive psychology, well-being science, or flourishing scholarship. They're somewhat interchangeable, but really I approach things more from that well-being science philosophy foundation. And there is a very formal course of study around eudaimonic well-being. And so when I wanted to begin a PhD, I had to learn about what eudaimonia was, how it could be defined, how we could design for it. And that led me into more positive psychology theory and therefore eudaimonic well-being theory. And with that, you can start understanding how we can interrogate the subject matter a little bit more easily, looking at things such as theory that existed, like self-determination theory by Ryan and Deci. That is a specific theory that is said to, if you were to aim for it and satisfy its three different tenets of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, that might enable us to realize eudaimonia. And so I thought that that was really interesting and ironically was something a lot of people were talking about as I did my PhD, which was during COVID, and everybody was really figuring out how do we get people back to the office? Oh, well, we just satisfy autonomy, competence, and relatedness, and it's going to magically happen. So that's kind of an interesting way that you can maybe design for the psychological principles on paper. But the other thing that I wanted to get into was how we could design for the ineffable and what we really want and the nuance of space. And I thought it would be interesting when doing some of the PhD work to not only design for self-determination theory, but juxtapose that with a more philosophical construct approach, where it was like asking people to design future for a space that enabled them to be their best selves. What might that look like? And I'd always done workshops with clients in the past for 2 decades, and again, very different scenarios, but how they could imagine their future spaces in 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, 10 years, what that looked like, how it would make them feel and look around and smell and etc. But if we were to do that with a really interesting, purposeful goal in mind, like eudaimonia, what might that look like? And so it really ticked a lot of the boxes for me. And as I got to know more and more about it, it was just so fascinating to see with Aristotle, it was not just being your best self in this perfectionist state. It was recognizing that you're getting the optimal support that you need throughout the peaks and the valleys of your life, and realizing that you can still be your best and do good and make better choices. And there's a lot of interactivity and an emphasis again on connection and different types of friends. So, I was working with older adults to examine how we could design for eudaimonia at home virtually during COVID with all these people who were living alone as well.
Yeah.
And I wanted to do it with creative methods. And it was really fascinating just to see what it brought up with people as they were getting different cultural probe packages that I sent to their homes so that they could do activities in their homes while thinking about their homes, taking photos, drawing different things to represent their day in the life, etc. And that was really fascinating just to play with. And then we eventually did online virtual workshops with designers and had the designers design for their future 73-year-old selves to reference some work that had been done in the past by some other designers. And I just thought it would be a really interesting way to not only look at eudaimonia, but also interrogate inclusive environments, because there's this really interesting work happening with inclusive design, accessible design, et cetera. It is not new, but I was new to it when I started my PhD. And I thought that that was something that, as a strategist, it would make perfect sense to do more of. If we meaningfully design with people, then especially if we take into account older adult experiences throughout their life and that lived experience, then we could design for other demographics. And Jeremy Meyerson, who was recently on your podcast, he had the bullseye diagram that I referenced. And, by designing for people at the edges, you can design for people on average. And, instead of just designing for the typical 18 to 30-year-old white male that a lot of designs in the past would only aim for, this would be a different way of going about things. And of course, with neuro-inclusive design and other approaches, that's been something that's resonated with me. And again, comes back full circle, almost poetically, to designing for one's best self and all the different types of ones there are and selves there are, and doing that with a variety of demographics who all occupy buildings but are oftentimes forgotten. So there are a lot of different ways that we could look at eudaimonia. We could get into, that creative idea too, where it's sometimes seen as the playful house elf, whether it chooses to visit you or not for creativity. But
Yeah.
yeah, the more I learn about it, the more fascinated I am.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. When we mentioned about it before, when we spoke before we recorded this podcast, um, yeah, I mean, obviously it was from the Nicomachean ethics, from 300 BC when he was writing Aristotle, and it was all about how we live our best lives, basically, how we create things. But the daimon, the spirit, this kind of, like you say, that elf, that kind of spirit of creativity, if you want, as well. And it also means split. I mean, if you start analysing the word, although I don't think he really did analyse the words quite a lot in the ethics, but I love how you've taken it. You've taken the concept and you're using it as this kind of like a baseline to make sure that everybody. So when we're designing, how can we create these spaces and places for people that they're really going to, like you say, they flourish and all that kind of thing, but actually they have that. And I think that's it, that spirit within them to be the best versions of themselves, really, isn't it? Whether, and you just mentioned the different age groups and the outliers, those people that are on the edge, that if we include everybody in our design process, then we help them find their eudaimonia ultimately. Yeah.
Yeah, and we can activate that energy as well. And I think that was something that I found unintentionally through the work that we were doing, because by designing for self-determination theory, it's believed that you can activate intrinsic motivation. And so things I didn't even ask the participants to do, they started doing because they wanted to curate their spaces so that they would be more supportive for themselves. And the people themselves signed up for different classes and, anything that they thought would make them stronger and more connected. And that was really fascinating to see, especially with some of the folks who were saying that they had procrastinated some activities for years. And after doing some of the workshops and really carefully thinking about their life conditions and their environments, they felt more in control and that they could do something to kind of cultivate their own flourishing. And that was really beautiful to see.
That's really lovely. Really lovely, actually. You're kind of enabling them and giving them the time and the space as well to think about what's really means something to them. If we both share this passion for the multidisciplinary approach to problems, which I absolutely love. And And the reason I set the journal up was to try and bring silos together so that we're not just talking about planning, we're not just talking about landscape architecture, we're not just talking about architecture, we're looking at everything. And I know that's something that you really feel passionate about as well. I mean, where do you see the issues mainly lying, and the sort of problems that you're seeing arise from this like non-collaborative approach that we're trying to break down?
And I think your mention of breaking down silos before was really funny. I think if we were to fill up the silos and maybe build bridges across them,
Yeah.
that's almost how I envision it sometimes. And I've been talking a lot of about the multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, depending upon your definition. But those different perspectives, to me, it is about bridging, and it's about having this clarity on how we could perhaps learn from different disciplines and take that knowledge as wisdom and infuse it into something else in a different way. And really, by definition, that's creativity, it's innovation, it's all these things that are oftentimes considered a separate course of study
Mm.
only in business. But what I've been trying to do is really recognize what's happening in one discipline and pull that into another, and see different ways that we could activate that understanding. So even just this year, I've started going to more creativity events, speaking at different groups. Like I just went to one in Paris when I was working in Europe that was called Creativity and Changing Brains. And that's a little bit about the neuroaesthetics, neuroarts community, which I find really fascinating, about just doing things with your hands or by singing. And I'm a musician, but by singing, you activate that connection with people almost more effectively than any other group activity that you can do. But, really recognizing that, but then figuring out like, oh, that's very interesting. But how can we activate some similar feelings when we're doing a group design activity? And, we're talking about designing for a stadium, and we're trying to just get the engineers and the architects to speak to one another in a way that's actually going to move us forward toward the end goal. And then how can we interpret that differently for pedagogy and, classroom application and getting students to do the same thing, things that we ask them to do all the time, but we don't always give them the toolkits and everything that they need to actually have those conversations and do that work, especially in a way that prompts creativity and is benefited by creativity instead of just doing the same old way of approaching things. So for me, it's just recognizing that there's value in learning from different disciplines and connecting in different ways. There's knowledge, of course, in different geographies and then different demographic approaches. It's just having that openness to interpretation and, perhaps figuring out how can we connect those dots in a way that sounds interesting, and how can we also do so in a way that's not just doing it for fun, but doing it for something that's actually going to have impact and value. And oftentimes that happens by involving the appropriate groups along the way so that you get that co-design approach in a way that's not just a box ticking exercise, but something that's more legitimate and that they help to then own the output of as a consequence. And even the praxis of, if you do it right. I mean, if they're really engaged in the process, hopefully they'll have input on how that was done right or how it could be done better later. But to me, it's just pulling all those things together. And I keep joking lately that more and more of my work is just interrogating the messy middle or the gray areas in between. Everybody likes the black and white. And I guess ever since I was a kid, being lived vicariously through for my parents, this like technical father and then this artsy mother, I think it just happened that way when I was young, and I recognized beauty in both sides of things, and I continue to like to do that even to this day.
And there's such a value. There's such a value looking at, like you say, those grey areas in everything, actually. Even if you're having an argument, there's always a bit in the middle, isn't there, where you need to come into, where there's often the answer,
Yeah.
isn't it?
And gray gets a bad rap, I think. But, oftentimes you think of gray literature as, recognizing things like the brain. So maybe there's something thoughtful in that discourse. So we can interrogate the gray in a good way, not just it being dull and mundane.
Yeah, exactly. And also the word you used there, was it was empowerment, or giving them ownership. That was the word you used. Giving ownership to people to make that choice. And you mentioned that earlier as well about when you were doing the workshops and giving them the choice to choose what they want to do. I think that's and again when you're creating spaces, it's giving people the choice to go into the quiet space or go into the collaborative space and things. So it's about empowering people, and I think you have that gift. I mean, and your whole, your whole career now is now focused on those grey areas. It's about how do we activate those grey areas. Can you can you sort of maybe give us an example, or can you explain how you actually do that? How you actually activate those grey areas, those kind of those bits in between.
Yeah, I think how it's done is, for me, it really comes from a place of love of learning and
Mm,
curiosity. So if I'm pulled onto a project, it's, getting smart on as much as I can, as quickly as possible,
mm,
understanding all the inner workings of the team, the firm, where they hope to go, where they've been, having that understanding is always really important to me. And also recognizing how they work, how they wish to work, things that they recognize as their strengths and their weaknesses, so that we can plug into that and have something that will also resonate with them, but also know that we are inevitably going to hit a path of resistance. So it's just a matter of how we can navigate that terrain when that happens. But it's also understanding the things that when we talk, identifying what they find to be of interest or thought provoking. So if we talk about, for example, if I'm meeting with a group that's an engineering firm and they're trying to perhaps infuse a little bit more health and well-being knowledge into their approaches, hearing from them what they find interesting. I'll often ask them, what do you think are some good buildings? Where have you seen some good design work happening elsewhere that you're hoping to emulate? What does that look like? And then I start learning a little bit about their aesthetic and what they're going after. And then from there, we can figure out how to weave in examples and then therefore capabilities within their firm in a way that they're more comfortable with. And then they're starting to aim for something that they really want to be able to realize, instead of just, resisting the entire way, pushing back on something that they really don't care if they attain or not. And I think that that's forgotten a lot, especially in consulting practices and projects where you're brought in to do something because one person in a C-suite said that they wanted something and they got the funding to do it. And then really when you're brought in, you're working with everyone else in the company and nobody really cares to see that happen. But instead, if it becomes more of an exercise and a learning process together, then we can figure out, all right, is this really what we want to go for? Let's first evaluate our end goal here. And then I always joke that it's really hard to shake that consultant out of me. And even my PhD was done in such a way, it was how I learned Consulting 101. But it was looking back and having your as is fully defined. Where are we now? And then having a really clear goal on where do we want to be? What's that to be future state? And then navigating the gap in the middle. How can we figure out that delta from here to there? And then also learning from history. We say it all the time. Some of the best lessons learned are from history. Looking back and reflecting on things that we did in the past, what was good, what was bad, what was ugly, and have that really inform where we are now, and then how we can go to those future steps from there. So, really, a lot of different answers to that, but yeah, it's really being able to read a room. It's doing a lot of homework. It's trying to be quick on your feet, having a lot of things just in your back pocket, ready to pull out at a moment's notice, and also staying very aware with what's happening in the world so that it's not just, saying this is what's happening down the road that I think you all should do here. It's this is what's happening on the other side of the earth, and here's where it's being done really well. They happen to have a similar climate and, similar budgets and timelines and things like that. So let's learn from them and build in a way that's going to actually be a good definition that you want to be able to consider yourselves to be with your work.
That's great. Yeah. And you just saying that about we learn from history. I remember Cicero saying that, to not know what happened before we were born is to remain forever a child. And yes, well,
Mm.
that sort of, I suppose maybe an innocence is quite nice, but actually we can learn a lot. And I like how you say all that messy stuff as well. What can we learn that we don't, rather than dumbing it down, let's dig into it and go, well, actually, yeah, maybe we don't want to do that process that led to that. Maybe we can stop whatever it is, the snowball that's going down the hill that we actually is going to cause potentially the same thing that happened 200 years ago or whatever it is. So, in terms of the design world, particularly, I think that's what I love about biophilic design is that if you are a biophilic design practitioner, you have to know a little bit about ecology, you have to know a little bit about architecture, you have to know a little bit about planning, you have to understand a bit of neuroscience in order to achieve the best outcome, I think, for your design. How would you like to see the design world working together?
I think the other problem with siloing is the fact that it's not just how the work gets done, it's how the work is bid out oftentimes. When you have this thought about, oh, we're going to go to market and we're going to put this out there and it's going to be this one way. And it's going to be, this activity is going to be for the engineers, this activity is going to be for the architects. And I'm starting to see that change, but it's still not exactly what I would like to see at this point in time. I had hoped that we'd be slightly more mature by now, but it is a process. So instead, I think if we can have requests for proposals go out that are more for an end goal and, maybe some requirements along the way, but not over architecting the call in such a way that it really defines how the work's being done and by whom, that alone could really help with that interweaving of knowledge. And also allow for transdisciplinarians like me to be able to answer those more easily. Because a lot of times, people are bid out of the process because they may not have the one requirement that's needed and oftentimes isn't really needed. It's just put in there as a line item because it always has been that way. So I think if we can break down some of those barriers and, just comfortable ways of doing, that could definitely lead us to a better way of doing things in the end. I also think measurement, while very valuable, needn't only focus on quantitative. I mean, I am somebody who has all degrees in engineering, but I have a deep appreciation for nuance. That's why we need to talk to people, do post-occupancy evaluations, see how people really feel in spaces once they inhabit them. But that balance of quantitative and qualitative is rarely called for and certainly not always measured and therefore validated. So even incorporating post-occupancy evaluations so that we get some qualitative loop feedback, that's really key. But also measuring things that aren't just necessities, to meet the necessities of mechanical engineering, sorts of air quality. Instead, being able to measure what's the light level and what's the good color of that light and how is that feeding into our circadian rhythm. And things like building standard and Fitwell are certainly enabling us to get farther along in that goal. But I think that's still an opt-in option. It's not something that everybody has to do and therefore does. So bit by bit, we are getting better at doing this, but I think we need to be, again, a little bit more open-minded in how we call out for this work, do the work, and then follow up on it afterwards. And, get a little bit out of our comfort zones also and how it's done instead of just same old, same old. It needs to be more creative.
Mhm. Lovely. I love that. Absolutely. I think having an artist's brain or having a creative brain, you do think about things slightly lopsided, maybe more than but that's what's really great about your unconventional background is that you've come from the arts and you've come from engineering, or you've come from engineering and you come from the arts. You've got both sides of things. So you look at things with that meld, that kind of double-pronged approach, really. So you're starting from that perspective anyway. So you're just going to see things, it's not just that, and it's not just black and it's not just white, it's grey. So absolutely. Can you ever give us an example of a project you've worked on? Because you've got some really interesting things that you've been involved in.
Some of the ones that I've enjoyed most recently have been less the commercial office buildings of the past, because I was doing a lot of those for quite some time, but focusing more on healthcare and education. So, from a healthcare environment, there have been a few efforts lately where it's been focusing not only on patient experience, but also on the people who are working there day in and day out for staff and surgeons. And that's been something that's been really lovely to be able to do. So, I've done some of that work in Asia, getting in, especially from some of the pre-strategy meetings to help everybody ideate where they want to go, what that might look like, where it's being done well, how we can perhaps do things in a way that doesn't only focus on the inner workings of the envelope, with no access to windows or good air quality or anything else, but instead really focusing on the perimeter, doing appropriate design so that the patients can have that access to views and light, and also something that's more navigable. So not just thinking about wayfinding and good signage, which of course is often forgotten when you come to healthcare design, but encouraging patients to be able to perhaps postoperatively get around more easily and do a walkabout in a way that is encouraging and not making them feel like they're in the way. Because I know that that's something that is what a lot of patients have told me, that they feel uncomfortable walking around with, maybe their IV bag, and knowing that they're slow and they're kind of a wide load because of all the things that they're carrying around. And they don't want to rehabilitate well because they feel like they'll be in the way. And so we've done some dedicated paths, almost like bike lanes in some of the designs that we've been talking about. And then, of course, having those weave into the outside too, so that we get people outside of the hospital environment, which, when you're recovering, doesn't happen. Like I had a few surgeries during my PhD, and one of which I was hospitalized for an entire week. And I was so excited when my husband would just help bust me out so that we could walk out and just, breathe fresh air and see the trees and listen to birdsong. And the number of projects I've been able to work on lately, just by incorporating things like birdsong or dedicated family zones for well-being, so that when they perhaps get not so great news, they have a place to really retreat and process, but not be in a dark, sad environment. Have something that's going to really help them understand the ebb and flow of nature, and maybe recognize that, with life comes death, or, perhaps just challenges. And that's been another thing that really goes back to the psychology and the philosophy-based approach for eudaimonia. And I've really liked incorporating that into some of the healthcare projects. And then some other ones that I've done lately have been with schools. A lot of the schools are, of course, thinking a little bit differently in terms of neuro-inclusive design. And I've really enjoyed that. I've, over the past few years living in Australia, recognized I'm very sensory sensitive. And this is something that I've been able to explore with my husband, who also does work with people with disabilities. So we've been collaborating on some different projects about how we can design workplaces, but also school environments, so that perhaps we're not going to have all these hard surfaces, and we're not going to just focus on the conventional desk and maybe teacher desk setup. It's really having something that's a little bit more open-ended, allowing for different color, different lighting zones, different retreat spaces, and of course, tactile touch points and, comfortable materials, all these things that in the past were just not really part of the language, and certainly not part of the brief that was sent out. So I've really enjoyed playing in some of that space, while also emphasizing serious play in school, because we now get a little bit into pedagogy too. So when I'm coming in, a lot of the teachers I've worked with and the people who are running the schools, and of course, like the design teams, they're thinking about how we can actually design that space. But the teachers want to talk about, how is this going to influence how I'm teaching things, what I'm teaching? And that to me has been a really interesting conversation coming out of my PhD and getting involved with a little bit of teaching. How can we do this better? And how can we activate that knowledge and get the students excited, and, maybe enliven the material in such a way that isn't just this, again, oh, I'm going to do history because we have to, because that's the year, or we're going to focus on mathematics in this way. It's having that different type of thinking and understanding that math can be done in different ways, and how a problem is solved might resonate differently than how it could be solved by another student. And maybe offering different areas within the room to encourage that type of thinking through play, or, perhaps even just working out a problem on a board versus playing with blocks. So to me, that's where, again, we get a little bit more interesting in our thought process. And that's a really fun thing to interrogate together with a group who brings very different things to the fore that I would have never thought of if I were on my own.
Yeah, I love that. And going back to the interdisciplinary thing and biophilic design, to be fair, and biophilia and this nature connection, I think if we can incorporate nature into the curriculum as well. I mean, like I did a podcast with the School of Biophilia, and that's what they
Mm.
do. They try and bring like nature patterns and sort of like leaf collection or whatever it is, kind of different activations that will help physics learn about gravity or something. I'm just making that up, but I think that again, looking at what you're talking, this whole interdisciplinary thing, if we can break that mold as well in actually the curriculum and how they do it and by through the design. So if they have got access to nature or if they have got access to outside, and like you say, these little zones that people can go to, but they've got different textures and textiles and everything else, which will stimulate them in a different way or not stimulate them, will calm them down or whatever. I think, yeah, it's very, very exciting. And I know you've worked on these grand scale projects like the healthcare spaces, and it's so lovely
Yes.
that you're approaching it with that sensitivity for families, particularly who might not be receiving the best news rather than and I mean this is the whole reason I've set the journal up is because my own experience in a normal hospital environment where you are receiving the awful news and there's all harsh, it's reflective surfaces and everything, so being able to create or have an understanding and also the willingness of the client to want to do the right thing, and I think they just don't know the pathway, and that's what a great designer, biophilic designer, but like what you're doing as well, can do, can really enable these spaces that will hold people in those times of need and yeah, um, and challenges. But you've worked on these grand scale projects, but I know that you've brought like the kind of concepts into a more personal or more kind of like or different, kind of more at home, if you want, learnings that look like to day-to-day experiences. Can you give us an example, maybe a little bit of that, please?
Yeah, of course. I think one thing that you and I talked about is, not only just curating our own spaces in a way that speaks to us and perhaps has plants and natural light access, et cetera, but also just the parents. Something that I had happen right when I finished my PhD was that my father got really ill, almost inexplicably, and he's in the US, and I had to up and leave to go take care of him. And we were able to rehabilitate him by applying a lot of the work that I had been doing in a one-on-one way, which was really fascinating to me. I hadn't really done that in any proof of concept way, especially on that scale. And yeah, at one point, once we got everything back in physical working order for him, getting his organs functioning properly, et cetera, and he was being discharged, he unfortunately had a fall and had a brain bleed and became delusional for a few months. And he's fine now, but he's fine because I was very active in his rehabilitation and made sure that he was constantly in places where he was being actively rehabbed and that we would have touch points and resonating references to things of his past, really good memories instead of things that might trigger something that would be uncomfortable. And there were countless times when I was in Italy, for example, I attended the Moving Boundaries event that was in Italy about a year and a half ago. And we were there talking about neuroarchitecture and neuroarts. And I was getting phone calls about my father falling. And then he would call me pretending that well, he wasn't pretending, but he thought that he was in a child home that he had lived in when he was young. And he said, "Oh, I'm at these people's house. I can look outside and I'm seeing the horses in the backyard." And he was really just envisioning these because I realized later there were some pictures on the walls that were reminding him of pictures that they had had in that home that he stayed in. And it's just understanding that we have these affordances in our environments and we have these trigger points. And by ameliorating the bad ones and intentionally placing good ones, we can really offer some of that push and pull that can help pull somebody into recovery. And people just overlook that potential for environments to do that and have that transformative power. And I saw it firsthand, not only with things that were viewable, so looking at sight and again, those references in that way, but making sure that his air quality was really good. So cognitively, he was getting better very steadily. And then he's also very audibly inclined. He's a bit musical himself at times. So he really loves classical music. So instead of just having the horrible music from the hallway coming in, just bothering him and being this cacophonous noise, I made sure to keep his door closed, made sure that we had good buffer and that we could have lovely music that he appreciated. And all those different activations of his brain and references to home and history, I think really helped in that regard. And I saw the power of design in that way. And, we talk about it all the time, but to be able to see it firsthand with family who were in a really bad place and all of a sudden, because of place, became healthier and happier, that made all the difference in the world. So yeah, I definitely see that transformative power of flourishing design, as I always talk about, and now firsthand. Yeah.
Oh, that's really beautiful. Lovely story. Thank you for sharing that very personal story with us.
Mm.
Jenna is going to be speaking at the Biophilic Design Conference held in November, on the 17th of November at Westminster, where it is totally interdisciplinary. So, and you're going to be speaking about eudaimonia and how sort of biophilia fits into that whole thing and creates that eudaimonic feeling within us all. So make sure you check out biophilicdesignconference.com where you can buy tickets because they're still on sale. Well, before I ask you the final magic question, is there anything else that you'd like to add at this point?
I don't think so. I think we've had some lovely conversations before today and today. And yeah, I enjoy the work that you do. And I think biophilic design should be inherent in everything. So anything that we can do to uplift that work and come back to our origin story, which I think biophilia really does, then all the better. I think we'll become better for it.
That's lovely. Well, thank you. And so the final magic question that I ask everybody on the podcast, if you could paint the world with a magic brush of biophilia, what would it look like?
To me, it would include open-mindedness, vision, interest, color, beautiful light, and also just that empowerment, but in a way that's going to also allow for engagement and interaction. So it's not uplifting any one person higher than another. It's having that ongoing connection across humans and uplifting the individual, the society, the planetary aspects of health and well-being. I think only then can we achieve that symbiosis that's going to enable us to truly be our best selves.
Thank you for listening to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast.